Javier Perez Burgos, who is a policy specialist and development economist, and he's the co-founder and chief officer at Weya that develops amazing new solutions for financing supply chains in agriculture. Javier, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sally. So, hi everyone. Once again, my name is Javier Perez Burgos, and I'm a development economist, and I've worked mostly on agriculture and rural development across academia, government, multilateral agencies, and most recently as an entrepreneur. My recent work has been mostly on technology and finance in order to address some of the challenges and bottlenecks that food production, especially concentrated on smallholder farmer spaces. And my work really focuses on how differently from other sectors like real estate, retail, transportation, where recent technological changes have had dramatically disruptions in the systems. Nothing like that has happened in agriculture so far. And I believe that apart from the traditional framework that explain this by adoption of a user adoption framework, which means that farmers have not been able to adapt to these new technologies or tools. I definitely believe that the institutional system behind agricultural value chains have not introduced the tools that allow this scale up or systematic change to happen in agriculture. And if we think about it, we're living in a world where our food system is deteriorating more rapidly than we are able to respond. We have almost 300 million people facing food insecurity. And rural development models are fragile against climate or supply chain shocks, as we have seen recently. New models of technological or digital agriculture only reach less than 10% of smallholder farmers. We keep on seeing gender and territorial gaps entrench, and institutional coordination and financial inclusion still remain the main challenges for rural innovation, not technology ability. So this is where I want to propose a different lens. And I don't know, I don't think that digital agriculture is failing because of farmers don't adopt technology, but I think because so far institutions have never been redesigned to understand these digital systems. And what I want to do during this 1 month residency is to develop a conceptual and empirical model that treats digital technology as an institutional transformation rather than as an input, like it has been treated in other sectors. So what does it mean that users or farmers do not resist technology? And the evidence shows that in terms of scale, especially, for example, in low and middle income countries, adoption remains still very low. Providers of different technological services in the production, in the retail, in the commercialization part of the value chain still face high transaction costs. The middlemen or midstream actors are extremely important in these value chains, mostly constituted by agricultural SMEs. They still face extremely high financial barriers. And what this means is that at the end, even though we have new tools, new technology, the value capturing, it's distributed unevenly across the value chain. And most of the risk is still pushed downwards. And pushed downwards means that most of the risk is still being absorbed only by farmers and most of it by smallholder farmers. And there's three root causes for this. We're still treating technology once again as an input, not as an institution. The current financial architecture is misaligned with the rural reality, and risk is concentrated at the bottom of the system. So most of the frameworks believe or work on the concept that the barrier or the reality of agricultural technology not being able to scale is because of an adoption problem by the user, by the farmers. But I believe that these digital tools definitely shape the way information flows, power, and coordination across different stakeholders in the value chain, which means that it's changing the institutional alignment of the systems. Finance is still unsuitable for most of farmers. It doesn't still understand, even with technological change, uh, to align or develop incentives and data sharing governance that once again decreases risk. And we're seeing risk still left on climate production, retail risk being absorbed by farmers. Um, I I think that moving from a tool analysis towards an institutional analysis is gonna allow us to see that rural economies as a system can allocate information, risk, and power differently. And once we're able to internalize this in the way we regulate, we develop governance across these systems, we're gonna see changes, and those changes can mean scaling up in the adaptation of these new tools in agriculture. And so one of the questions that I'm looking at is, if we know that these technologies have clear benefits, most of them in terms of productivity, like higher yields, less intensive use of agrochemicals, for example, why are we not seeing scale-up solutions? So I believe that it's a matter that farmers would adopt these technologies once they see their risk declining, but risk is not declining. Farmers are still seeing risks in terms of demand, prices, retail, climate shocks. So even with this advancement in tools, as long as we don't treat risk differently or distribute that risk more efficiently in the value chain, I don't think we're gonna see changes in adaptation. Um, and we're seeing the development of tools not working towards the main bottlenecks, meaning working capital constraints, and that's the least part of the ecosystem that's been created. Different actors in the value chain do not have the right incentives to share data and coordinate, which is a problem, especially if you want to promote high skill innovation or adaptation processes. And we're seeing credit and financial systems that are not designed for data-driven agriculture or climate volatility that this sector is facing. So the hypothesis is, once again, is that technology is failing because the adoption is mismodeled, And if we treat it as an input, but I think it really should be treated as an institution. We have seen, especially in over the past decade, where we have an exponential increase in agrotechnological services and tool, that technology alone does not move the needle. As I said, we have seen clear benefits in terms of productivity, nutrition gains in food systems. But what we have not seen, like massive adoption um, changes. Most of the work or most of the services and technologies created either are focused on the farmers or on the end buyers or corporates that buy the produce. But recent evidence suggests that the midstream actors, those that deal with the logistics, processing, storage, and contracting, have a lot to say and are extremely important in these value chains. And we keep on seeing either government or private sector solutions at farm level basis. And finance is still key. And we don't have a financial system that adapts or introduces or even uses this technology for to scale. So some of the questions that I'm looking for to answer or at least provide a value added are on how digital credit data and traceability can change power relationships across agricultural value chains, especially those related to food systems. With the increase of different advisory services, with climate data, with yield data, how those decisions have really affected risk taking. With all this new data produced, and we can bring examples, for example, from recent EU regulation towards deforestation value chains. How can this data be an asset and be an asset for those that work under the most informal conditions, such as smallholder farmers? And what institutional arrangements can enable us to scale up without reinforcing the inequality or the uneven distribution of risk in this sector? Um, I'll conduct a mixed method approach. I'll use digitally provide farmers data from Latin America, plus some qualitative case studies that I've seen over the last few years to try to propose a new typology for digital adoption pathways in agriculture and show what has been the impact of tech adoption on risk, cash flow, and gender dynamics. And trying to see that digital agriculture really can become a just digital transformation or an example of an effective just digital transition. And also provide some policy and market principles to scale transformation. And I think this digital or technological agricultural change can become a just digital transition, basically because it fulfills three principles: equity, risk redistribution, and institutional legitimacy. And equity, because I think it can decrease gaps that we have seen at a gender or territorial levels. It can ensure data rights and more fair value capture across the value chain. When we redistribute risk from farmers through more integrated finance, traceability, and coordinated value chain designs, we have more efficient food systems and institutional legitimacy, because if we have trusted data systems and accountable actors across the chain, the adoption is going to be more transparent and effective. Um, some of the policy implications that I'm planning to address are the redesign of rural finance across data ecosystems. So I think we can move from a traditional collateral lending analysis to more of cash flow aligned lending in credit, insurance payments, and climate information. We can incentivize value chain digitalization if we create incentives for buyers, aggregators, financiers, and input suppliers, for example. Definitely establish rules for data governance, ownership, portability, and transparency to protect farmers. And that is not clear right now, in especially with the new innovations. We can reward and design tools that promote sustainable agriculture, such as regenerative practices, and strengthen very important rural institutions, such as cooperatives, SMEs, and local organizations. Mm, the contributions are going to be conceptual, empirical in terms of policy and also in institutional relevance. I think the framework would add to what's written about right now in terms of institutions, risk, and incentives in agriculture. It can provide a new set of evidence, especially for Latin American cases. We can give a blueprint for a just digital transition, which is especially in the new environmental dialogues and challenges, can be a good example of a new just transition, and also work with global initiatives such as Paris IAS Socioscope, which advances, of course, in the work of inequality and institutional change. What I hope to get during this month residency from the IAS community is some conceptual feedback and some ideas on or inputs on how this idea that technology adoption can be treated as an institutional transformation. Of course, methodological guidance, maybe ways in which can we integrate behavioral data into this system level analysis with different disciplines. And of course, some comparative insights and connections, perspectives from other regions with initiatives that may use this case to strengthen global relevance. So finally, I think that technology and especially digital agriculture will not scale by improving tools. We're seeing every day tools improving and showing more efficient ways that we can produce food. But I think it will scale when we redesign the systems around them, the incentives, the institution, and the financial architectures that currently shape rural life. So thank you very much, and I'm eager to take any questions or comments about the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javier. And this is an interesting connection with the previous presentation about the management of resources and society. So there's just one or two things, because I'm not familiar with what you call digital agriculture. And first, I understand that you take institutions in the modern sense of institutional economics, of the set of behaviors that are expected from the actors. And so my understanding is you want to really have a systemic change, just as it happened in other value chains. I mean, transport, energy, and whatever. And you're wondering why it didn't happen in agriculture. But you're talking about two different things. So this is where I'm a bit puzzled. So the first one is sort of the classic improvement that we would expect in value chain when we bring information technology and digitization, such as managing the transaction costs, right? Lowering them and then improving the cooperation, which then fits very well with your question of making this an institution that changes the way people work together and providing a technical infrastructure for this. But the other one is the question of risk management. And I think this is a different one. And perhaps you should explain a bit more what you mean by this. My understanding is, from what I've seen in Latin America, is for example, the process of contracting for floor prices. Okay, like for example, the buyers would agree to buy a certain amount of the production at a floor price, and maybe with some fluctuation. So this is actually buffering risks, right? And for both sides, and we've seen this in various places. So do you have, I mean, first, is this what you mean by changing the financial distribution of risk? And what are the other ways in which digitization is actually going to change institutions in balancing risk and optimizing the value chain? So if you could give us some examples so we understand better.
Okay. Thank you, Sadi. So first, by digital agriculture, I mean it's the group of new technologies or services that have changed the way in which these value chains operate, and they go from biotech improvements on seeds and soil fertilizers, for example, to even like production practices, technical assistance services, and even in some cases logistics and retail, right? So that's the so what I've seen is that even though there's proven benefits on some of these technologies, most of them are focused on the improvements of productivity in agriculture, especially like increasing yields or diminishing costs. We haven't seen technologies that scale up across regions or across macro regions, as we have seen in other cases, as I said, like in, I don't know, transportation, retail, real estate, to put some examples. So, and my thesis is that I believe that this hasn't happened because the current institutional framework has not internalized these advancements or changes, which means that risk is still distributed unevenly across the value chains. If you come to think about food systems, farmers is where risk still is mostly concentrated, and especially in smallholder farmers, because they have to internalize price risks, climate change risks, commercialization risks. So I think that the bottleneck has been that even though we have seen proven positive effects of new technologies, risks haven't changed. So the behavior of farmers, yeah.
I understand, but could you give us some examples of how these technologies could change the institutions, or how they have done that in some other value chains?
Yes. So for example, I don't know. I'm thinking of a coffee producer in Colombia that we have worked with, and so this farmer has had access to technical assistance or services through WhatsApp bots. So getting information about weather conditions, prices, and new sustainable agricultural practices. But the farmer still operates under very informal conditions. Has to work with midstream buyers, still doesn't have certainty in terms of prices. So nothing really changes in terms of the farmer's scale of operation or the way that the crop is normally developed. So that's why that's what triggers me in terms of understanding why, if we have tools that so evidently can transform the system, it hasn't happened in this sector.
Okay. Jeremy?
So we're competing with the schoolyard out here.
Yeah.
Some kids are having a great time. Maybe this is a slight turn on Sadi's question. So I'm interested in this issue, around how institutional, as you put it, institutional context internalize or externalize. In this particular case, the rewards and risk allocation system. And maybe as I was thinking, listening to you, I was taken back to a much earlier literature or way of thinking that may provide a partial clue into Sadi's question about how you move up and down your scales from big value chains and credit systems all the way down to small farmers on the ground. So how important are property rights and property relations to this? Because you're trying to bring smallholding farmers into a global infrastructure where they're at the very margins of, let's say, an economic regime, and they don't. And the question of security and property, I would have thought at once it would have been one of the major hurdles. And resolving that a stepping stone to resolving this issue. So, 30 years ago, that's what everybody would have fixated on, right? Which was pre-distribution.
To tell you, a short answer is that they remain extremely important. So, for example, the financial system, it's still based on traditional collateral lending, and with huge informality on land tenure. It means that we have a bottleneck in terms of working capital access. But the idea is that we have an enormous amount of data, information, both on the farmers, both on climate, both on understanding risk more broadly. But financial institutions and even fintech haven't been able to incorporate that in order to scale these solutions. So just to give you an idea, and this is part of also my questions, recent EU regulation in terms of making sure that whatever product you sell to the EU doesn't promote deforestation, it's creating a lot of data. So we have a lot of detailed data, geographical data at the farm level producer. And that's a requirement to be able to export to the EU. But we don't have right now ideas on the governance and the value of that data. But if a traditional financial institution could use that data, we could move from traditional collateral-based lending to maybe data or another analysis of risk that would solve the bottleneck. So that's part of the other questions.
So sorry to interrupt. So does that mean rethinking what we define as valuable property away from land to information?
Yeah, especially because we haven't been able to move the needle in that sense. We're still seeing agricultural as a sector that needs traditional guarantees, and I think that view has limited the possibility of having more resilient and sustainable food systems.
I think, you talked about, middle structures. What we've been doing, because you talked about the socioscope also, what we've been observing is the extreme importance of mesostructures, and this could be municipalities, but they can be also very large actors, right? And they can also be trade unions, associations, and whatever. And so a lot of these solutions of size, which is what Jeremy alluded to, can actually be solved if these people, cooperate as a union. If we look at an example, you were talking about coffee growers in Colombia, and they were post-crisis precisely after one of the ends of the civil war, Jeremy, actually. And so they started growing, BlackBerry and Postobon, which was one of the major drink companies, helped these guys to organize into cooperatives, which is good for them because they talk to 42 cooperatives instead of 1,700 BlackBerry growers. But this enables these cooperatives to have enough capacity to work with people who help them to improve their techniques, in terms of accounting, in terms of agricultural practice and stuff like that. So maybe one way of addressing this is changing the scale by having the small ones unite in some larger structures, and we've seen a lot of these things. The question is that it does not necessarily come from the small ones themselves because they don't have the time and they're basically the head under the water. But this is where the role of the mesostructure comes in, because they can organize, they can provide, they can start, and they can provide the spark for these things to grow afterwards. So perhaps one of the interesting things to look at would be where there has been success, connected with the way these people unite and what unites them. And we're again, it's interesting today. We're very much about what enables changing scale in all these processes. And suddenly, when it changes scale, it's a different phenomenon.
Yeah. Thank you, Sadi. I think that's a very good approach, and because we normally see even research and the developments on solutions targeting individual farmers or the big like end buyers or corporates that agri-industrial, but not those cooperatives, associations, either even local governments that are extreme important players in this value chain.
I've been working on food for a long time in my career, and we've always been focusing on the food chain, right? Those people who produce, transform. But if you look at how that works, you have to involve, for example, the banks. You have to involve the people who make the technology. That's exactly what you're talking about. Is how you enable these people to be considered as a part of the food chain. And perhaps the vision of the farmers or some of the middlemen is that they do not see themselves as part of the larger system, but just as part of the food chain.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thanks.
And I could turn to you the question that you asked Jeremy, actually, in terms of methods. So you're basing yourself on your own experience and case study, but I understand that Weya is also introducing. I mean, it's a live experiment, right? That you're trying to create these financing system in the procurement chain. How does that work?
Yeah, so we started with traceability. So just trying to see if having data would make value chains more efficiently, and especially provide access to other value-added services. But then traceability for itself was not a tool that either farmers or end buyers would pay for the service, except when regulation demanded it. And so then we added the finance aspect. So we used the traceability information to create an alternative risk assessment mechanism and provide finance to farmers. But right now, like what we're seeing is that from two perspectives, like on the application side, few farmers are willing to adapt or to get the service if they don't see like real life application on a region or that it works. Because I think, and that this is more on the qualitative work, that for them, like I think it's if they put their hands on this solution, like if they lose a crop, it's they lose a year of work, right? So that's on that front. But on the investment part of the business, where we deal with investment funds across the globe, we have seen that investment in agrotechnological firms has decreased 38% in the last 5 years. And most of the argument on the investment funds is that they are not seeing the scales that they expect, especially when they come from a venture capital perspective on other sectors, as I said, retail, transportation, real estate.
Mhm.
And I think that's a problem because it's very different to have like I don't know, an Airbnb than dealing with food systems, because it's in a world where we have 300 million people with food insecurity, and we have all these challenges with climate change and food systems. And that's what I believe, that the norms and regulations need to be addressed in order to to be able to use this technological innovation into have a more resilient and sustainable food
Mhm.
system globally. So that's part of the
All right. But norms are about what you see others doing, right? And so you have a problem here is that you do not see the sort of contamination and explosion that Jeremy described
Yeah.
in the civil wars, right? So we actually have this thing of when you scale up from small to larger. I mean, this is the fact of you do it by example. You said, they need to see something working, but some sectors are exposed massively to seeing what others are doing, but these farmers are stuck in their local,
Yeah.
farm, and they don't see what's happening out there. So perhaps the solution is enabling this contamination of diffusion,
Effect.
whatever
Yeah.
you call that,
The
to get to
spillover
the
effect.
scale effects, because it
Mm.
can't work at small scale, as I understand, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's an enormous amount of work to be done in terms of how between the micro and the macro, the phenomena happen. And this is difficult because it's not the same laws as we know that operate at different scales. I mean, we know that in physics, and it's very difficult for modeling. We're now having the same problem in social science as we're trying to study systems, right?
Yeah.
And this is, with the Socioscope, we're doing this with Helga Novotny, and then we're fascinated by how much important is the role of the mesostructures in sparking and managing the regulation of the whole thing. I mean, that's how micro to macro happens. It's not by accident or aggregation, as some very naive old economic models assumed, right? There are middlemen, but these ones are reflexive on the system, and they're trying to operate and manage it. And that's exactly what you're trying to do with your organization. And
Yeah.
we see the problems of scale. I'm sorry, I shouldn't speak all the time. Anyone else has other questions? Otherwise, we'll have to send that back to discussion at lunch and coffee in our great institute. Any other comments, my friends? No? Thank you very much again, and I wish you a great end of afternoon and a great weekend.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Sally.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.